what has always been very clear to me is that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we owe the founders of this community a deep debt of gratitude for the work that they did and the generosity that they showed that we can never repay. And we are forever grateful to all of those who came before us, who gave of their time, who gave of their money to help make Jewish Ottawa vibrant. We stand on the shoulders of giants.
Our history is our treasure that we keep in a humble, bursting at the seams archive at the Jewish Federation of Ottawa. Archives can seem inaccessible, but with this podcast, we're bringing the archives to you. Honoring the past is one of the 613 commandments, or mitzvot, of Judaism. 613 is also the area code of Ottawa, the capital city of Canada, a city that hosts a vibrant, historical Jewish community. 613 Archives is where we dig into the shelves and drawers of the Ottawa Jewish Archives for stories that bring our past into the present. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tegan Goldsmith, your host and archivist. You're listening to 613 Archives, the podcast for the Ottawa Jewish Archives. Episode 6, We Stand on the Shoulders of Giants, 90 Years of Federation. The year is 1934. Representatives of Ottawa's 4 Jewish congregations sit around a table in the vestry rooms of the King Edward Avenue Synagogue on a Sunday morning in late March. Around the table sit the men whose shoulders this community was built on. Kaplan, Schaefer, Cohen, Sachs, Dworkin, and Palmer are only a few of the names that occupy the space. These men have not met out of leisure or prayer. They've met to discuss the formation of one of Ottawa's oldest Jewish organizations. They have met to discuss the formation of the Ottawa Vaad Ha'Ir. The Vaad, today known as the Jewish Federation of Ottawa, has been a foundation in our community for almost 90 years. Many don't know that the two organizations are the same, stretching the span of almost a century and supporting the community's growth since the mid-1930s. The Vaad, as it was popularly known, created the bedrock that this community was built on, and it began with the search for a rabbi. Jews have resided in Ottawa since the early 1860s. Prior to the establishment of a congregation or synagogue, Jewish residences would meet in each other's homes on high holidays to celebrate and partake in ritual together. This remained until Ottawa's first synagogue was built in 1904. By the early 1930s, Ottawa had grown to comprise of 4 synagogues: King Edward Avenue, Murray Street, James Street, and Rideau Street. By this point, Ottawa's Jewish population had reached well over 3,000 people, and between the 4 congregations, they were struggling to retain rabbinic services. This was due to the financial challenges brought on by the Great Depression. It was hard for individual synagogues to maintain a salary for a rabbi. In 1932, a meeting was held between representatives of each of the 4 synagogues with the goal of finding a solution for this problem. After several months of negotiations, it was agreed that each synagogue would pay an equal percentage of a rabbi's salary, which would be set at $2,500 annually. With this agreement reached, the next step was to find a rabbi who would serve the 4 congregations. This group reconvened under the title of the Associated Synagogues of Ottawa, and they began a search. In 1933, Rabbi Reverend Abraham H. Friedman accepted the position and became the Associated Synagogues of Ottawa's first appointment, and in turn became Ottawa's first community rabbi. Proportionate payment continued to be the standard working formula for the next 20 years for employing 5 different community/city rabbis. It was from this cooperation and group that the idea for the Ottawa Vaad Ha'Ir was born. On August 28, 1933, the Associated Synagogues of Ottawa held a meeting. During this meeting, a discussion arose regarding the need for a city-wide Jewish council. Mr. Caspar Kaplan put forth a motion where which he proposed that, quote, the executives of the Associated Synagogues of Ottawa recommend that a Vaad Ha'Ir of 26 members be appointed by the congregations, and that this body administer the various branches of Jewish activities in the city, principally kashrut, Jewish education, and spiritual guidance, with powers to act for the congregations in the advancement of Judaism in the city, unquote. From synagogue care to cemetery maintenance, the goal was to have everything and everyone united under one organization. 4 months later, on January 5th, 1934, Mr. L. Harry Goldman sent a letter to Mr. A. Cohen of the Murray Street Shul. The letter, addressed to Mr. Cohen, and really the congregation, stated that a special meeting had been held 2 days prior to discuss the creation of the Vaad Ha'Ir and that the Vaad Ha'Ir was in favor of establishment. The letter stated, quote, "The necessity for a Vaad Ha'Ir in Ottawa is very evident, as it is desirable that the 4 synagogues be represented on the boards of the various Jewish institutions, such as the Vaad Ha'Ir, the Talmud Torah, the Folkschule, etc. In this way, only will we be able to feel that we have a united Jewish community in our city. Many occasions arise during the year when a central body is absolutely essential to the successful development of certain projects, and the absence of such organization leaves a gap in which it is quite embarrassing at times. One instance of this might be cited. Last Rosh Hashanah, when money was collected by each synagogue for the relief of German Jewry, there was no united body under which auspice the money could be forwarded to Europe. The individual after individual refused the responsibility of sending the accumulated sum. This is only one example, but it is intended to illustrate that a Vaad Ha'Ir, which would have handled the money satisfactorily, is positively necessary," unquote. The purpose, as stated in the letter of the Vaad Ha'Ir, would be to be a, quote, "united council to which representative Jews from each synagogue would be sent, and this council, in the final analysis, would have the say on any question which was a Jewish interest. It would be subdivided into various committees, which would function on the various Jewish institutional boards, and withal, it would work towards the unification of the Jewish community in Ottawa," unquote. At this meeting that Mr. L. Harry Goldman's letter references, a vote took place in which 2 synagogues, King Edward and Rideau Street, had voted in favor of creating a Vaad Ha'Ir, and James Street had voted against. The Murray Street Shul was the only one to not cast a vote. In his letter to Mr. A. Cohen, Mr. L. Harry Goldman encouraged him at the next general meeting of the Murray Street Shul to have the entire congregation vote on the matter and let them know of their decision as soon as possible. As you may have already guessed, they voted in favor of the establishment of a Jewish council. The first regular meeting of the Jewish Community Council of Ottawa, or the Vaad Ha'Ir, was held on Sunday, April 29, 1934. This meeting consisted of 31 people from each of the 4 synagogues, and they discussed what establishing the Vaad would entail and who would hold what positions. First, 5 executive officers were elected. They were Mr. A.J. Freeman as president, Mr. T. Sachs as vice president, Mr. A. Dworkin as treasurer, Mr. B. Pearl as honorary secretary, and Mr. L. H. Goldman as secretary. A discussion was then held regarding how the group would look. 2 days later, on May 1st, a full meeting of the council was held, and the discussion revolved around committees. The Vaad, while overseeing the operations of a united community, would consist of 8 standing committees, focused on an aspect of the community that would enhance Jewish life and benefit everyone. These committees were the Vaad Ha'Ir, the Talmud Torah, the Cemetery Committee, Public Relations, a Spiritual Enhancement Group, a Charities Committee, an Arbitration Committee, and youth organizations. Each committee was made up of 3 to 15 members, and for the most part had at least one member from each congregation present so that all voices could be represented. The Vaad Ha'Ir Committee was not a new group. In fact, if you'll recall from earlier, it was one of the organizations that was in favor of creating the Vaad. In 1927, the Vaad Ha'Ir of Ottawa received its letters patents from the Canadian government, allowing them to operate in the city. Their purpose was to supervise the actions of Jewish butchers preparing, distributing, and selling of meat to members of the Jewish community, to establish and enforce regulations for the implementation of Jewish dietary laws, and to employ slaughterers holding certificates from the proper authorities. Once the Vaad was established, the group became one of the standing committees and had to apply for another letters patent under the new organization's name. Throughout the 1930s, this committee also ensured that taxes collected from kosher butchers went toward financing the Talmud Torah. The Vaad Ha'Ir Committee was comprised of 12 members, which included W. Badovsky, C. Kaplan, A. Dworkin, M. Dworkin, S. Kronik, M. Lukovitz, M. Palmer, B. Pearl, L. Pedagorsky, T. Sachs, A. Sherman, and S. Tanner. Ottawa still has a Vaad Ha'Ir organization, operating under the Jewish Federation of Ottawa, and we're one of only a few cities in Canada that still has one. Like the Vaad Ha'Ir, the Talmud Torah was also an established board prior to the inception of the Vaad. The Ottawa Talmud Torah Board was established in 1923 after many years of attempting to organize one. Prior to 1923, each synagogue had its own afternoon school where they taught their congregation's children. With the establishment of the board and the purchase of a school located at 171 George Street, all afternoon schools amalgamated into one institution. By 1935, 150 students attended the Talmud Torah. Like the Vaad Ha'Ir committee, the board became a standing committee with the organization of the Vaad and provided financial and advisory support to the school. The Talmud Torah Committee was the largest, comprised of 15 members, including B. M. Alexander, C. Kaplan, M. Cohen, J. R. Fogel, A. Gordon, S. Kronik, L. Lokovitz, M. Loeb, M. B. Margosha, Dr. S. Mirsky, B. Pearl, M. J. Sachs, A. Schaefer, A. Sherman, and M. Zagerman. This committee and the Vaad placed a lot of emphasis and support on raising money for the Talmud Torah, as educating the future of the Jewish community was and still is a priority. As a result, a subcommittee of the Talmud Torah was created, consisting of Dr. Mirsky, Mr. Kaplan, Mr. Lerner, Mr. Schaefer, and Mr. Finkelstein, who were to ensure that 1 cent from every pound of meat purchased from kosher butchers would go to the Talmud Torah. This, of course, coincided with the Vaad Ha'Ir's committee's collecting. The Cemetery Committee was comprised of 12 members, including B. Cooper, L. S. Greenberg, M. Greenberg, W. Holzman, A. Kurt, S. Kronik, B. Leaf, H. N. Pearl, Dr. C. Shapiro, M. Shore, M. Stein, and B. Stream. The purpose of the Cemetery Committee was, of course, to oversee the maintenance and overall operations of Ottawa's Jewish cemeteries. This included the beautification of the cemetery without sacrificing plots, contacting the Hever Kadisha when burial preparations began, and in general, supervising funerals. At this time, in 1934, Ottawa only had one Jewish cemetery, located on modern-day Bank Street. The second cemetery, located in Greeley, Ontario, wouldn't be built until the early 1970s. Up until this time, each synagogue had its own plot of land in the cemetery and retained halakhic control over their individual plots. The Cemetery Committee seems to be the one that received the most pushback, as each congregation wanted to maintain full control over their respective areas. This caused issues over the next few decades as debates around financing, services, and maintenance were brought up to the committee. To learn more about the history of Ottawa's Jewish cemeteries, check out episode 5 of our podcast. The Public Relations Committee was the smallest group, comprised of 3 members, which included M. R. Friedman, L. Freeman, and S. Berger. Their purpose was to ensure that media outlets and organizations weren't depicting the Jewish community in an unhonest way. As outlined in a document from May 31st, 1934, the duties of the Public Relations Committee was to, quote, contact with the daily press in order to eliminate or to at least curtail, if possible, the multi-publicity given to petty meetings held under auspices of various local Jewish organizations and individuals. To eliminate, if possible, certain publications that to a measure create the impression among our Jewish neighbors that they represent the views of the Jewish community. To safeguard against vilification of the Jewish name in any form, whether in print or by word of mouth, or by means of radio broadcasts or by stage. To speak officially for the Jewish community of Ottawa in all matters pertaining to publicity, unquote. During the 1930s, when anti-Semitism was the norm, this was an important committee to have to ensure that falsities and lies weren't being spread, and if they were being properly addressed. The Spiritual Enhancement Committee was made up of 9 members, including A. Betterman, C. Kaplan, M. Cohen, A. Dworkin, M. Loeb, Dr. S. Mirsky, B. Pearl, T. Sachs, and A. Sherman. This committee resembled the original Associated Synagogues of Ottawa group, as they oversaw religious matters within the community. Thanks to the previously mentioned group, Ottawa had appointed its first community rabbi 1 year prior, and it became the duty of this committee to organize which days and times Rabbi Friedman was needed at each synagogue. They would arrange for guest speakers at each synagogue throughout the year. Since the Vaad was comprised of a mix of members from each congregation, it makes sense that the Spiritual Enhancement Committee would have members from each synagogue. This would ensure that each synagogue's individual schedules and needs were expressed and taken into consideration when planning was required. In a report from January 28, 1935, Mr. M. Cohen updated the committee on the activities of the Spiritual Enhancement Committee, stating, quote, Friday evening lectures had commenced on November 2nd, 1934, and had continued at the Rideau Street Synagogue until December 21st, 1934. During this time, two speakers, Rabbi Rosenberg of Montreal and Rabbi Miller from Far Rockaway, New York, delivered lectures, unquote. He concluded by saying the series would continue and that Rabbi Friedman would be conducting Bible study group every second week and a class on Zionism and biblical study once a week. The Charities Committee was one of the main reasons many advocated for the implementation of a Jewish council in Ottawa. This committee was made up of 8 members, including M. Drazen, Mrs. A.J. Freeman, L. Leposky, E.M. Lerner, Reverend J. Mirsky, M.J. Sachs, A. Sherman, and H. Silver. The purpose of this committee was to manage soliciting for charity in the city and to ensure that yearly donation subscriptions were collected and distributed to institutions that needed it the most. Their job was also to ensure that local charity campaigns wouldn't overshadow each other, so everyone had a fair chance at raising funds. At a meeting held on October 7th, 1934, that was open to all members of the Jewish community, it was announced by committee member M.J. Sachs that money had previously been pledged to the relief of European Jews had not been paid and requested that money soon be sent to the new committee to manage. It was also announced that any campaigns going forward would need to fill out and submit a questionnaire to the Vaad Ha'Ir for approval before moving forward. This committee eventually morphed into the JFO's annual campaign, raising millions of dollars every year to support the community's various organizations. The Arbitration Committee is the one standing committee that we don't seem to have any minutes or records on. From what we understand, this group was used to solve disputes within the community, and it was made up of 6 members, including B.M. Alexander, S. Berger, A.J. Freeman, M. Lockovitz, M.J. Sachs, and A. Sherman. Finally, the Youth Organizations Committee was comprised of 7 members: B.M. Alexander, S. Berger, Dr. H. Dover, Dr. S. Mirsky, H. Schenkman, Dr. C. Shapiro, and 1 female member who was unnamed in the records. The purpose of this committee was to oversee and organize all youth activities in the city for young boys and girls. It was to bring a, quote, view towards bringing the younger element closer to the realization of their responsibility to carry on the heritage that is theirs, unquote. They were also to set up a youth council that would direct their activities toward benefiting the community. While many of these standing committees are still around today in their own capacity, they are by no means the only committees that came out of the creation of the Vaad. Over the past 90 years, a number of different committees have been created to accommodate the needs of the community as they arose. Committees like the Vaad's Breakfast Club, the War Services Committee, Interfaith and World Jewry Committee, and most recently, the Shoah Committee are all examples of new groups being formed under the Vaad in order to meet a need in the community. The purpose of the Vaad and these innumerable standing committees was to find ways to better the lives of Jews living in our city. Today, many of these groups don't use the word committee to describe themselves. For example, PJ Library or Hillel Ottawa are both groups under Federation that serve a different demographic in the community to meet people where they're at to provide a Jewish experience. Now, let's get back to the history. This first meeting set the foundation for what the Vaad would become. From what we can tell from meeting minutes and institutional records, the Vaad met quarterly, while standing committees met as needed to discuss issues and projects. At these quarterly meetings, updates were brought forward by the chairman of each standing committee, and larger matters were voted on amongst the group as a whole. On October 7th, 1934, 5 months after the first meeting of the newly formed Vaad, the entirety of Ottawa's Jewish community was involved in a mass meeting in the Talmud Torah Hall. A.J. Freeman, president of the Vaad, was joined at the platform by various chairmen of the committees. The purpose of this meeting, and inviting the entire community, was to outline the purposes, aims, and objectives of the Jewish Community Council and to discuss what had already been accomplished in the last few months. Mr. Freeman explained that the council, quote, represents every congregation in the city as well as every Jewish organization that wishes to identify themselves with Jewish activities, unquote. He also stated that up until this point, fundraisers and campaigns for money had been conducted without audit and accounting. The Vaad would now oversee these activities to ensure proper reporting would happen. With that, the first public meeting of the Vaad Ha'Ir was held, and the Vaad's history began. Over the next 70 years, the Vaad continued to grow, adding new agencies, standing committees, and expanding to accommodate the growing community. In fact, Ottawa's Jewish population had grown from around 3,000 in the 1930s to a little over 11,000 in the 1990s, well over 1,000 new people per year. As said by Mitchell Bellman, executive director of the Vaad and later Jewish Federation of Ottawa from 1997 to 2013, quote, "It was and has been one of the fastest growing Jewish communities in Canada," unquote. During these 70 years, the Vaad's community work has been consistent. In 1951, the first Jewish community center in Ottawa was built and completed under the direction of the Vaad and through community donation and campaigning. The majority of this work was undertaken by Hy Hochberg, executive secretary for the Vaad in the late 1940s, and in 1950, he was named executive director of Ottawa's first JCC. Of course, the Vaad's work didn't just stop at creating Jewish spaces. It extended into community and international care and well-being. In 1975, after concerns were brought forward regarding the availability of social services in Ottawa's Jewish community, a survey was put out by the Vaad, and by 1980, Jewish Family Services was created. When the treatment of Jews under the Soviet Union had become dire in the 1980s, multiple committees were formed and protests commenced to fight back against the injustice. If there was an issue that needed to be addressed, the Vaad stepped forward and worked towards a solution. The late 1990s brought with it a wave of change to the Jewish community, and the Vaad in particular. The beloved first Jewish community center built on Chapel Street in the 1950s could no longer accommodate the community's needs, and plans for a new center were discussed.
Rebuilding of the community's facilities, and a very difficult decision for the community to proceed with, and a project that many people doubted whether it was advisable or whether it would be successful or whether the community could afford it. So the community invested heavily in moving its communal center and facilities from Lower Town to the West End.
That was Mitchell Bellman. Mitchell was around during arguably one of the most transformative times in the Vaad's history. He saw both the building of a new community campus and the shift from Vaad to JFO.
There was no IT department. There was no IT services. There was no website. There was no use of technology back then. And it was really in a period of great, of rapid transition as we built this campus and immediately became a focal point. It was a beloved facility that very few people came to on Chapel Street. And you didn't have to worry about many people being there, to a very high profile community campus that was not just the center of Jewish life, but the center of broader community life and broader community attention. And so it was a rapid transformation for the community at that time.
In September 1998, the new Soloway Jewish Community Center opened its doors to the community for the first time, featuring a brand new fitness center, pool, gym, library, archives, and so much more. It also included new offices for the Vaad and its staff to operate out of. In 2003, the Vaad made a major shift. After decades of operating under the same system, it was decided to restructure the Vaad, taking away some of the outdated governance and technologies and implementing staffing, boards, and procedures that were more modern and could better serve the community. Mitchell Bellman, as president, was center of it all.
With that growth came opportunities, new demands for services, a significant growth in fundraising, a complete change of its staffing needs of the community, and the kind of administration that the central organization needed, a change in its allocation process and its governance process, really a change in its way that it connected with Israel and the way the community, went through, from the assassination of the Israeli prime minister to a series of suicide bombing attacks, and a change in the way the community viewed its own safety and the safety of Israel.
With this shift came a change in name as well. The name that had been used for the past 70 years would come to a close, and the Jewish Federation of Ottawa would be born. Still with the same goals and mission as the original organization, but with new governance, new technologies, and new issues that faced our community in the new millennia. 90 years after the fact, how much do you think the Vaad/Federation has changed? We started with a small group of community members driven to make a change in the way our community operated and have transitioned to a point where this same group is at the center of all community life. Prior to writing this episode, I spoke with 3 people who I thought would give me a diverse look at the Federation and the Vaad. I spoke with Mitchell Bellman, president of the Vaad through its transition into the Jewish Federation of Ottawa. I spoke with Andrea Friedman, current president and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Ottawa. And finally, I spoke with Jessica Greenberg, who has agreed to chair the Jewish Federation of Ottawa's board of directors in 4 years. I chose these 3 people because their perspectives represent the past, the present, and the future of this organization.
I always believe that if you didn't have the organization, you would want to create it, and that it's a sense of the success of the community, that there's a strong central organization looking at its broad interests, trying to raise money and funds to support big initiatives and significant agencies in the community, and trying to coordinate the diverse elements of the community. I think that its success really, it's how the Vaad started. It started by trying to bring a diverse group of synagogues together, trying to create one Jewish school, trying to create one kashrut agency. The history of the Federation in Ottawa, it's still influenced by the Vaad because you have elements that the Federation assumes responsibility for that many other communities don't. I think we're one of the only ones left that still does kashrut.
It's true. The success really does come from how the Vaad was started. Its goal was to unite a group of diverse people, in this case, the congregations of 4 different synagogues. This is what it continues to do. Unite our Jewish community to make it stronger.
Federation was created to protect and promote Jewish life in Ottawa. And I think that's what they still do. And I think that's what they're going to continue to do. It's just that the methodology will continue to iterate over time. And, I have meeting our community where they are at will continue to iterate over time as we as a community change.
That was Jessica Greenberg, future chair of our board of directors and 3rd generation in her family to not only sit on the Vaad/Federation's board of directors, but also to chair it. When speaking with her about the importance of Federation, she talked about how hard it would be to sustain Jewish life in Ottawa without Federation sitting at the center.
The Jewish Federation makes sure that our agencies are all afloat, right? And they can lend a helping hand, whether it's in funding or governance or whatever those things are, to make sure that our community is being served by all the agencies that our community needs to be served with. And, with very few exceptions, like our bigger agencies, that would maybe be able to sort of go it alone. I really believe that without Federation, a lot of the most critical organizations that create Jewish life in Ottawa would slowly go away. I also think that as a non-religious entity, it supports a space for Jews of all backgrounds to just be in Jewish spaces, living Jewish life. So I think it plays a pretty important role in the community.
Finally, I spoke with Andrea Friedman about Federation now versus the Vaad when it was created and asked if she sees any changes over the last 90 years.
The Federation, as the Vaad did, existed to make sure that Jewish Ottawa was strong and that it was a vibrant community. And that hasn't changed in 90 years. That remains the mandate today, just as it was in yesteryear. I think it's just about execution that's changed. And so one of the key differences is the diffusion of power in the Jewish community. There's lots of core Jewish institutions now in Jewish Ottawa. And so Federation's role is often to convene those organizations because we are stronger together. But the core mandate, the words might be slightly different, but the whole idea is that we want Jewish Ottawa to thrive. And that's what Federation has always done. I think we try to honor the traditions that the founders set for us, but the world does change. I think that they would be so proud of all the various Jewish institutions in Ottawa and the great people who lead them, the professionals and volunteers, and the passion that everybody brings. We try to do their memory and their vision justice every single day.
Let me leave you with one final thought. Inside the Ottawa Jewish Archives is a fireproof vault that contains almost the entirety of our community's historical documents. Our collection is broken down into 6 categories consisting of businesses, congregations, education, family/individuals, organizations, and reference. These are then broken down further into something called fond, which is basically a subject. For example, the Ottawa Jewish Archives fond is a box containing all the historical documents for the Ottawa Jewish Archives history. It contains organizational records, photos, letters, diaries, and anything else that helps to tell us the story of the archive's history. A fond can be as small as a single folder or as large as multiple boxes. Out of the more than 400 fonds the archives keep safe, the Vaad/Jewish Federation of Ottawa is the largest. It sits at 98 bankers' boxes worth of historical records. That's not even counting the numerous photos, audio, and digital records in our multimedia section. This alone speaks volumes to what this group has done for our community. You'd be hard-pressed to find any organization in our community that hasn't been touched by Federation in one way or another. They are the reason our community has survived, thrived, and succeeded despite challenges thrown our way. This past December, when I spoke with Mitchell Bellman about the history of the Vaad and his role in it, he said something that struck a chord with me. He said, "I believe that if you didn't have the organization, you would want to create it." I think he's right. The Vaad and the Federation filled a space in this community that I think many of us don't realize would be empty if it wasn't there. It allows the space for everyone to experience their Jewishness how they see fit. Whether it's attending synagogue or a Jewish day school, or just knowing there's a place for you at the JCC, for the last 90 years, the Vaad and Federation have made that happen. 613 Archives has been brought to you by the Ottawa Jewish Archives. This episode was written by archivist Tegan Goldsmith and produced by Hot Shoe Productions. For more information on the Ottawa Jewish Archives, find us on Facebook or visit our website at jewishottawa.com/Ottawa-Jewish-Archives. Special thanks to Andrea Friedman, Mitchell Bellman, and Jessica Greenberg for taking the time to speak with me. We'd also like to thank the children of Sid Cohen for funding this episode and for their continued support.